Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History. Welcome to another week. And we started this series, this mini series, it's a three-part series last week. And my first episode was the backstory to the Ukraine-Russia war and how the United States was very much involved in pushing this conflict to where we are today, driving it towards this uh, goal, this desired goal, which was a proxy war with the Russians. And so we went through the history and we talked about all the broken promises, we talked about the broken treaties, we talked about the NATO expansion, and we talked about how uh, over and over again, Putin kept drawing a red line saying Ukraine is the red line, Ukraine and Georgia. And in both cases, U.S. presidents just ignored him, and they kept talking about NATO expansion into both Georgia and Ukraine. And on top of that, because we'd broken the ABM treaties, now we were putting missiles in these new NATO countries right on Russia's border. And so that led to a quick 5-day war with Georgia, which resulted in a uh, a peace, actually a pause, actually by in U.S. efforts to expand NATO, and then eventually invasion into Ukraine. And we interfered in their 2014 elections. We launched a coup to get rid of the guy that was in favor of neutrality and replace him with our puppet, who immediately stirred up trouble in the Donbass region, creating a war with the Russian-speaking Ukrainians. After which Putin came in to ostensibly rescue his Russian-speaking compatriots there. The result of that was a Minsk Accords, a peace between Russia and Ukraine, which everybody signed on to except Ukraine. And Ukraine didn't sign on to because they were ordered not to by uh, Barack Obama and his administration, specifically uh, Victoria Nuland, or Gloria, yeah, I think it's Victoria Nuland, who went over there and told him Zelensky, after he'd won the election, he couldn't sign on. So that led to more problems between Russia and Ukraine. Of course, the United States was stirring that pot. And finally, in 2022, to stop the inevitable, which was NATO expansion, Putin invaded Ukraine with only 40,000 troops, which clearly spells out his intentions, which was not to take Ukraine, but to drive the Ukrainians and specifically the United States back to the negotiating table. And there was another effort at peace. We talked about the Istanbul communique, again, which every country signed on to. Putin even started pulling out his troops. And again, this time Biden sent over Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of Britain, to tell Zelensky he couldn't negotiate with the Russians. And so here we've had all these efforts at peace. The U.S. has sabotaged all of them. We've had efforts to preserve some sort of nuclear balance, deterrence between us and the Russians. And we're the ones who broke that. That was George W. Bush who pulled out of the ABM treaties. And there's just, and after we promised we wouldn't move eastward 1 inch with NATO expansion, that was George H.W. Bush who made that promise to Mikhail Gorbachev. We've we've gone into 15 countries, way over 1,000 miles, and because we've broken the ABM treaties, we now put missiles on their border aimed at Russian targets. And then we act surprised and we run around and say, unprovoked, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. It's just the most unbelievable thing. If you don't know your history, and you're just looking at what happened in 2022, you might buy that. And a lot of Americans have. How many times have you opened up Facebook and you saw the Ukrainian flag avatar over somebody's face? And everyone's got Ukrainian flags here and there. There was a speech in Congress, I think it was a State of the Union Biden was given, where Nancy Pelosi, who was Speaker of the House, she and the Vice President, Kamala Harris, unfurled a Ukrainian flag. behind Biden as he was speaking. And of course, how many times did Zelensky address Congress and come to beating a path back and forth to Washington with his hand out asking for more money? And we were always told that the Ukrainians were the victims in this whole thing, and the Russians were the bad guys, especially Putin. So, and of course, this Putin fixation has been going on for a while. And we're going to talk today how that came to be because, we didn't have a Mikhail Gorbachev fixation. We didn't have a Boris Yeltsin fixation. For a period of time when Putin was Medvedev, I think it was his name, was in charge. We didn't have a fixation with him either. It's just been Putin. There's a reason. All right. There is a reason why if you say anything even resembling positive about the Russians, the media immediately smears you as a Putin lover or some sort of Putin supporter, or you're parroting Putin's talking points or whatever. It's just Putin, Putin, Putin all the time. It's always bad. Well, my radar goes up when I hear the media uh, all singing the same song from the same songbook. I immediately smell a rat. So I started investigating this. I wanted to know, why is Putin so hated by the West? What is it about Putin that has stirred the pot over here? And he's become the modern equivalent of Hitler. And he's a pejorative term in and of himself. So I wanted to discuss that today. So we will be looking at Vladimir Putin and some of the history here, because I think as we go through this, you're going to start seeing a different picture. And you're going to start recognizing some of the same things said about Putin, feared about Putin, that you hear about our current American president. There's a lot of similarities there. So I've titled this Vladimir Putin, the foil to post-Cold War U.S. hegemony. The goal by the United States, we define that as our goal was to create a unipolar world. During the Cold War, it was always a bipolar world. You had the United States in the West, you had the Soviets in the East, these two superpowers eyeing each other suspiciously. And pretty much everybody in the world had to take a side. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, the goal became, we talked about Brzezinski and his desire to move NATO right to the border of Russia so that we could create a unipolar world whereby the United States was the lone superpower. It dominated the world and it provided no avenue back for the Russians to reclaim their old position as the foil to the United States. And for a long time, it appeared that's the way things were going. And as long as the Russians leader was cooperative with the U.S. objectives, we never had any problems. Let's go back a little bit. In '89, which some people call the end of political history, because as far as the old world order, it just came all crashing down at that point. You had in the Soviet Union, you had that block that you're talking about Russia, and you're talking about all the satellites that all made up the Warsaw Pact of countries. It's imploding. There's revolutions happening everywhere. And we find out later that we're in large part that these revolutions are being funded by us as we, and I'm not saying it was wrong to do that. The Soviets were probably, they did that to us. This was a game that was being played. And there were revolutions taking place in Germany, and it just one after another, all these different satellite countries. It just spread like a cancer across the European continent. Then at the same time in China, you got those famous protests in Tiananmen Square, famous picture there, that young man standing in front of the tanks. And so the old world order, which had been established for so long, 50 years after World War II, and had been relatively stable, mainly out of fear, and was now coming apart at the seams. And this represents a lot of disorder, chaos, and anarchy, but at the same time, it also represents tremendous opportunity if you're the United States to step into that vacuum and take over control. And so let me move my face here. I'll just put it up here over Nike. You guys don't mind if I cover up Nike, do you? Make it a little bit smaller. So this sort of represents the beginning of a new political history in which the United States become a global empire. And the idea was that all these countries are going to become little replicas of the United States. They're going to drink our soda, our Coca-Cola. They're going to buy our shoes, Nikes. They're going to watch the same television shows. They're going to drive our vehicles. Wall Street's going to become a thing in their country. There's going to be the candidates that are running for office in their country are going to have to be approved candidates by the United States before they can be voted on by the people there. And then, of course, the internet, which was invented by the Americans, is going to be used, which ironically is very true today, is going to be used by the deep state to monitor and control the entire world. So this is sort of the assumption in 1989 as we stare into the future. This is what the United States sees for the world. This is our vision. You know, you're sat through some of these meetings where how many times did I sit through teacher meetings at school where we're working on a new vision statement for the school system or for that particular high school or whatever. I was in a church once where the pastor preached a 6-part series. It took 6 weeks for him to cover the church's new vision statement. I left the church right after that. I got so tired of it. It was unbelievable. These vision statements. Well, the United States had a vision statement in 1989. The vision was to create a world that looked very much like the United States. And of course, we would be in control of it. We would run it. It would be this unipolar world that was no threat to us, but was actually, you know, just like us. And would need, would depend on our systems and our culture, our economy, and all these different things just to exist. In fact, we would even pick up political leaders. And we've not had in history, if you look back and you study these transitions from one period of history into the next, most of these times it's all changing by a matter of force, right? These are not decisions that countries take on themselves and peacefully dismantle themselves. Okay, it's usually because an occupying power has come in and dismantled them, or there's been a war or a series of wars or a world war that has resulted in all kinds of upheaval. But here we have, in this particular case, a very unique situation, historically speaking, where the Soviet Union is willingly, peacefully, and of their own accord, dismantling their own empire. And it's because, as we learned before, they were forced to. They were broke. They were bankrupt. They couldn't go on. And so they were between a rock and a hard place. So Mikhail Gorbachev comes along, and in order to preserve what he can, which is the Russia nation proper there, he agrees to end the Cold War with the Americans. He can't keep up. Reagan had this spend, spend, spend mentality, which put us in debt, but it broke the Russians. And so it sort of worked. And so in order to end this spending binge by the Americans, where the Russians are trying to keep up, they basically called uncle or cried uncle. And they decided in the future, we're going to collaborate with the West on architecting a new peaceful future. In other words, we're going to be, instead of competitors, instead of working against each other and being enemies, we're going to work with you. And now we're going to be collaborators. We're going to be partners with you. And, at the time, there was all this hope. And I remember, because 1989 was the year I graduated from high school. So I was fixing to enter college. And I remember in government class, my senior year, watching the Berlin Wall come down. We all realized, just like students who sat there and watched 9/11 when I was teaching, and I remember I turned the TV on so they could watch 9/11. And everybody said then what I was saying back in 89, or what everybody was saying in 89, which is the world just changed. Uh, Things will never be the same. And that's exactly what happened in 89, 90, just like what happened uh, in 2001. So there was this, what people hope to be this era of goodwill, this unprecedented era of goodwill between the East and the West. But what we're learning now, and what we weren't, maybe the Soviets or the Russians were not aware of at the time, but quickly became aware of, was that the United States never intended to coexist peacefully with Russia, because Russia is still the largest country on earth geographically, as you can see on that map. That's a huge chunk of land. And it still had thousands of nuclear weapons. And so it wasn't that the United States, we were saying all the right things. If you go and you listen and read back some of the speeches that George H.W. Bush was giving at that time, some of our, James Baker, the Secretary of State, and others, we were saying all the right things. But we had, at that point, started to buy into this mentality, this which I call a very bad idea by Brzezinski and others, these neocons, that this peaceful coexistence was not going to work. We were going to establish hegemony around the world domination, this unipolar existence. And that would mean, and of course, other countries would not necessarily be open to that, wouldn't be, especially Russia. They didn't want to be dominated by the United States, but we were going to impose it upon them by force if necessary. And we were going to establish ourselves as the world superpower, the sole world superpower. So this era of goodwill is not going to last very long. The U.S. was thinking big picture, and there's some components to it. For example, we wanted to intentionally crush the Russian economy. We were going to send our advisors over after the transition. Mikhail Gorbachev is going to step down. The new leader is going to be Boris Yeltsin. We're going to come alongside Boris Yeltsin and pretend like we're there trying to help him, give him advice on how to transition a command economy, which the Soviets have been for, the Russians have been for 50 years, into a capitalist free market economy. And since we're the experts in that, they've never done it, we're going to come over, hold their hands, and walk them through it. Well, what they don't realize is we are intentionally going to come over and try to crash their economy. So, and this is all in part of this effort to just leave Russia a shambles. So it's no longer ever able to come back and be a competitor, a player on the world playing field, so to speak. So it's what we call shock therapy. We're going to introduce too much capitalism too quickly. And when you have not operated in a free market system ever, and all of the economic decision making has been made in a centralized bureaucracy or by a centralized bureaucracy operating in Moscow, and now all of a sudden you're introducing free market where freedom of choice and supply and demand, all these things that we're used to here in America, but we even have regulations, right? You can't do anything. You can't do just anything you want. There's regulations. We're going to introduce a version of capitalism to to the Russians that we don't even practice. It's so free. It's going to be such a shock to the system. It's going to be pretty much the same thing that happened to the Germans after World War II or after World War One, when the West went in and tried to reform Germany and crashed its economy and led to Adolf Hitler. economic calamity is such a destructive force on any civilization. Something is going to come in and fill that vacuum because people are going to be desperate and they're going to be looking for some kind of order to come out of the disorder, some kind of stability to come out of the chaos. And in Germany's case, it was Adolf Hitler who made all these big promises. In this case, we're hoping it's going to be us. Now we're going to destroy the Russian military. These are goals that we had. This was the 4-part goal, so to speak, to forever relegate Russia to the dustbin of history as far as its relevance to the world and its power that it had exhibited for so long. So you have to crash the economy, you have to destroy the military, and then you have to dismember the nation. It's not enough that the Soviet Union has been dismembered and all the Baltic states are now free and Russia is just back to being Russia again. We want to dismember Russia. There's 3 or 4 large ethnic groups within Russia that if we can exploit and manipulate them correctly, we can turn them against each other. And yeah, you've heard the old expression, united we stand, divided we fall. The goal, the American goal, was to get in there and stir the pot amongst these ethnic groups and turn one against the other and forcibly dismember the nation again. You know, that we've already dismembered them from the Soviet Empire. Now we're going to dismember and break apart Russia proper into 2 or 3 or possibly 4 different warring groups, and that weakens them. And no longer is it the largest geographical country in the world. It's 3 or 4 countries, and they're large, but they used to be a monster. So this was part of the goal. And then lastly was in an effort to ensure military supremacy was to expand NATO, the very thing we promised we wouldn't do. So we introduced Russia in the Boris Yeltsin era to the same kind of diplomacy that we had imposed earlier upon the American Indians here at home. And we briefly touched on this in the last episode, how the elites in America at that point in time bought into this idea that it was our manifest destiny to occupy the land from sea to shining sea. And whoever was in our way was just that. They were in our way. And because it was God's will, there's that famous picture of the angel leading the settlers west. Whoever was in our way, whatever it took to get them out of the way, whatever it took to remove them, we were justified in doing that because we had it was God's will. How many times throughout history has God been used as an excuse to mistreat people? You know, I think about even the old feudal economy in Europe, and the idea that you couldn't ever rise above your class, whatever class you were born into. You know, don't blame the nobles. Don't blame the clerics or the priests. They're the privileged classes. Blame God. He puts you in that. You were born a serf. I'm sorry. I was born into the nobleman class. He over there was born into the priesthood, whatever. And so once you're in that class, and God must have willed it that way. And you think about the old kings and their idea that they were given the right to be your rulers. It was called divine right because God chose them to be your king. And so if you disobey them, you're not really disobeying a man, you're disobeying God. He gave the king a lot of latitude to treat you any way he wanted. Well, here again, we're using the manifest destiny. This is This is God's will for us. Now we're doing it in Russia. And just like the serfs were mistreated and the American Indians were mistreated, and all the subjects of the kings for centuries and centuries were mistreated. Well, here again, we don't really care about the Russian people. They're just an obstacle to world domination, which is what we want. And we're going to lie over and over and over again, breaking these, quote, ironclad guarantees that we make to Russian leaders. It started with Mikhail Gorbachev. We promised him we're not going to move 1 inch eastward. After Germany reunifies, you don't have to worry about NATO moving 1 inch east towards your borders. And we just subsequently broke that promise one after another, just like we did to the American Indians. How many treaties do we make with the American Indians saying, well, we'll have peace if you'll just move from this location to that location. Oh, but we want to build a railroad to it. Okay, we'll have peace if you'll move from that second location to this new reservation. Oh, but we found gold on that reservation. Okay, we'll have peace if you'll move from that third location, reservation, to this new reservation, the Badlands, or someplace where there is nothing of value. You can't farm. We'll have peace if you'll stop chasing the buffalo and you'll settle down and live like farmers, we'll have peace. It was just one promise after another that we broke with the Indians, right? Well, here we are. We're going to break one promise after another with the Russians, and because our whole goal is to conquer Russia. And the thinking is, and this is the big picture view here, if Russia falls, then we can move on to the next big enemy, which is rising in the Far East, and that's China. And the expression was in American foreign policy circles, get the bear, which is Russia, you get the dragon. You get the bear and the dragon, you get the world. So it's pretty clear what our agenda is. And I could get into all the different people, but I think, basically our foreign policy establishment is divided at this time between neocons who ascribe to this philosophy, which is world domination, and the other ones are the realists who are saying, you can't antagonize the Russians, though they're down right now, you will give them a reason to get back up. They cannot accept these things that you're going to try to impose upon them. They will not accept that. Forget about China. You're not going to get Russia. And so the realists in American foreign policy within our government are saying, and this would be represented by people like William Perry, George Kennan, we talked about them in the last episode, even some foreign leaders like Sarkozy and Merkel, they were saying some of the same stuff, but none of our leaders would listen to them. They've bought into what Brzezinski has written about in his books. They've bought into this idea that the world is now unipolar, and the U.S. objective should be world hegemony, world domination, by any means necessary. So you have this tug of war going on in the U.S. government between the realists and the neocons, but it's really not a tug of war because the neocons are winning. And you look back over who was our president and who made up the State Department and all our diplomacy corps, it was neocons, from George H.W. Bush, followed up by Clinton, and all the NATO expansion started under Clinton in 97, and then followed up by George W. Bush, who pulled us out of the ABM treaties, and he's the one that said we're going to expand NATO into Georgia and Ukraine. That idea originated with him. And then after him, it was Obama. And Obama was the one who sent Victoria Nuland over and told Zelensky, you can't make peace with the Russians. This Donbass war, this is part of our plan to goad the Russians into a proxy war. You can't make peace with them. And then followed up by Biden, who sends Boris Johnson over and again tells Zelensky, you can't negotiate with the Russians because we need this Ukraine war because this is the proxy war with the Russians that we've been wanting. There's only one president I haven't named in all those lists. I start with H.W., followed up by Clinton, followed up by George W., followed up by Barack, followed up by Biden. That's 5 U.S. presidents. That represents, we called it a 30-year program, a 30-year foreign policy. Well, HW had 4 years. Clinton had 8. That's 12. Barack, or after Clinton, you had George W. He had 8. That's 20. Barack Obama had 8. That's 28. And Biden had 4. That's 32. 32 years of foreign policy controlled by neocons. And there was only 4 years in that 32 years that represented a return to realism and an idea that, A, we're not going to get involved in these forever wars, and NATO expansion is not healthy. It's not good. It's not helpful. And that was Trump. And you see what the hell they brought down on Trump. But there's a reason that because he represented a threat to this foreign policy, this 32-year program that had been ongoing. And all the other presidents, when they became president, signed on to it. They were informed, you're part of this process, and this is going to continue with or without you. And they all went along with it. And then you run into Trump, and he stands up to it. And all hell's going to break loose against Trump. We'll talk about that in episode 3. But there's another world leader who's going to emerge on the other side of the world who's going to stand up to it too. And these two people are going to represent the threats to this unipolar world, this existence, this world dominant existence the United States wanted. And something's going to have to be done about these two world leaders, Trump, and of course, the other one in the East is Putin. And you'll see as we go forward how Putin stood up to this. So you figure 32 years of this program, there's going to be some pretty devastating consequences to Russia. And as long as they're listening to and abiding by and going along with all these advisors the U.S. has sent over in the aftermath of the Soviet Empire collapsing. Yeltsin thought when he invited all these people over, when the U.S. came over and offered its help, that we were coming in as goodwill ambassadors to help them get back on their feet, not realizing they just invited the fox right into the hen house. And so inevitably, the collapse of the Soviet Union which, as we mentioned, was presided over by themselves. They dismantled their own empire, is going to be speeded up and helped along by all of the decisions and all of the advice and counsel the U.S. sends their way. The U.S. foreign policy establishment went into overdrive, sensing weakness at this point. They go into overdrive with this idea that the United States now could run the world. And it only makes up about 4% of the world's population. And so for the next 30, 32 some odd years, that's our agenda. It's this triumph of the neocons over political realism. Now, as I mentioned, the Russian people initially were happy to welcome this new friendship with the Americans. I remember the news stories. I was in college when they're coming out, and all this new cooperation between the East and West. Wow, what a nice new breath of fresh air after 45 years of hostilities. And everything American was now being celebrated in the East, specifically Russia, like you see here, McDonald's. But it was just everything culturally that they had been, a lot of them didn't even know it existed because they lived in a propagandized, censored world. And now they're getting exposed to it. The music, the movies, the fast food, the clothing, all those things. And then here comes all these American economists invading Russia and bringing with them this plan of world domination to destroy the Russian economy. And we talked about it a second ago. It's called shock therapy. And this is all going to take place during the era of Boris Yeltsin. So this is basically just organized theft. We're going to go into Russia in the 1990s. Our Wall Street brokers and con artists. And they're going to promise all these miracles of free market capitalism. And in doing so, the Russians are going to basically allow us to dismantle their entire country. In 1992, when these reforms that we initiated, that we advised that they should do, when they were introduced to Russia, the inflation rate in Russia skyrocketed to 2,500%. Go back, and I've drawn this parallel before. This is just like what happened in post-World War I Germany. The inflation there was so bad you could back a truck up to a grocery store full of cash and drop it on the cash register, and you wouldn't have enough money to buy a loaf of bread. No, the money was worthless. Same thing's happening in Russia. And this was intentional. Whenever I see inflation take off because of certain decisions made by policymakers in Washington or wherever, I remember this. And I wonder, is this purposeful? Because in the German case and in the Russian case, it was purposeful. They were foreign enemies that we were trying to vanquish permanently. And so we introduced inflation to their economy to destroy their economy, which would have ripple effects on other parts of society. And so whenever I see leaders in America make decisions that lead to rapid inflation here at home, I wonder if they're not just applying the same lessons that they've used previous in international situations here at home domestically, because they have a larger goal here. And it's just something to think about. Anyway, 2,500% inflation. You see the price of food and other things went up 25 times. You know, how many times over the last 4 years I went to the grocery store, and what used to cost me, if I got a full 1 cart load of groceries at Walmart, which is not exactly high-end shopping, folks, but you go to Walmart, you fill up a cart, and that used to be $150. And I thought that was a lot of money. $150 gets you 2 bags out the door now. I walked out the door the other day with 2 bags of groceries, and I'd spent $135, $140. Couldn't believe it. So, that's not 2,500%, but any inflation is noticeable. Unless you're, in the upper crust, you're a billionaire, and doesn't affect you one way or the other. Anyway, the savings of pensioners are wiped out because the money's no longer worth anything. So you work your whole life, and now you're expecting to get paid, and you're getting paid, but the money's not worth anything. So you can't live on it. The pension's worthless. And but this was all purposeful. That's the important thing to remember. That's what shock therapy was. Once the Russian currency was devalued to this inflation, then you can start selling off everything, because these Russian assets and things, they can't afford to maintain anything. So they have to sell it. And of course, they have to sell for cheap, right? Nobody in their country can afford to buy it. And here's where the Americans come in and the Europeans, and we swoop in, and we're buying all these Russian assets at fire sale discounts. Airlines, oil and gas fields, mines, factories, media outlets, et cetera, et cetera. And this is intentional. So we introduced free market capitalism and shocked the system to such a degree that we introduced inflation, 2,500% inflation. And now the Russians' money's worthless. They can't afford to maintain, they can't afford to buy anything. They can't afford to maintain what they have. And so they have to put stuff up for sale, and we start buying it for cheap. And then we start picking and choosing winners and losers in Russia itself, because this is how we're going to establish control in this country. We're going to find our puppets, the folks that we have selected, the folks that are on our side, the folks that will go along with what we want, and we'll leave them in charge, and they'll be our puppets, just like we just talked about Ukraine, right? In 2014, we didn't like the neutrality government of Yanukovych, so we got rid of him and brought in Poroshenko because he was our puppet. So we're going to do the same thing in Russia. We're going to select people who are going to end up with these assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars, which they're probably with, most definitely with US aid, being able to purchase all these things. And now they are the new rich, the oligarchy, which is ruled by a few. And they've been carefully chosen because of their politics and the fact that they agree with the West to lead Russia into the future as our proxy. In exchange, the Russian people at large, after all of these assets were sold off, we had told them that they would get a share of the profit, and we gave them a share worth $7. We literally, it was legalized theft. We went in and stole all the valuable assets of Russia after we introduced such terrible inflation that you couldn't afford to live. Then we picked out a few oligarchs that we were going to choose to be the new elites of their society, the U.S. puppets running Russia, and with the help of a lot of U.S. dollars, tax dollars, that subsidized all this, what we call economic terrorism. They became the new elites of Russian society at the expense of the Russian people. You know, the promise was capitalism was supposed to be this free market where, you know, you could rise through the ranks and become rich yourself. But what we did is we introduced another an oligarchy whereby we chose who were going to be the elites and the rich of the society going forward, and everybody else was the underlings, and they're going to be the, you know, it's not that much different than what they had before. You know, communism was all the decisions were centralized out of a bureaucracy. The winners and losers were designated by the state. If you're in the losing category, that means you're one of the workers, and you're poor and you work your whole life. You don't make any decisions on your own. You don't have any sovereignty over your own life. Your economic situation is never going to improve. And we've bait and switched the whole thing, and we've replaced communism with this new oligarchical kind of, it's another form of communism. Only instead of them being in charge, now we're in charge. That's all. That's the only thing that really changed, was who was in charge. Now we're in charge. And you say, when were we in charge of Russia? Well, you'll see. This results in about 8 years of Great Depression in Russia. And you just see all the things that happen in a depression are happening in Russia. The factories are shutting down, which means unemployment. The production of wheat, oil, and gas is falling. Nobody can afford to operate these things. A lot of these companies, nobody can afford to buy them, so they're not operating. And a lot of them are being sold to U.S. interest or to these oligarchs. So you have hyperinflation. Russia itself was producing less, which you can see a 40% drop in GDP. This always happens in a depression, because why produce more if nobody can buy it? You know, supply and demand, mass unemployment, widespread poverty. So you got Russian workers who aren't getting paid, and you have Russian children who are now becoming wards of the state because the parents can't afford to keep up their own families, so they're just left to go to their own devices. So 2 million, it's estimated that there are 2 million Russian children during this period of time became orphans. And of course, just like in our Great Depression during the 20s and 30s, you saw, especially among the male population, a skyrocketing suicide rate. And this is one of the things that happened in America. And we always take a time out during this period when I'm talking about the Great Depression with my students. We talk about what happened to a lot of the men. You know, the identity of most men is that you are especially back in the 20s here in America, but even in the 90s and 2000s in Russia, is if you're a man, you're a provider for your family, and you protect your family, you provide for your family, take care of your family. And if you can't do those things, what's your purpose? And so you start to see men in America, a lot of them would hop on trains and leave their families and become hobos. And that was best case scenario, because they'd been trying and trying and trying to get work, couldn't get work. they went through the loss, right? They went through the loss phase where you lose your job, then you lose your house, then you lose your car, and your teenage boy runs off. He figures he can make a better living on his own. Uh, you're reminded on a daily basis that you're not providing for your family as you see them starving, and it just breaks you down. And next thing you know, if you didn't run away, and by the way, that's my wife running around behind me there. So if you see that, that's who that is. Um, I asked her, I told her I was doing this video, and she came right in the middle. Perfect timing. Anyway, so um, what was I saying? Oh, the men. So if they didn't, some of them made the calculation, if we hop on a train and leave, at least we're not staring at the empty faces of our kids and our wife anymore. And, we can't stand that. We can't bear to see that anymore. So now we'll just run away and become a hobo. But a lot of them chose suicide. That was here in America. That was back in the 20s. Well, we got the same symptoms. We got the same problems occurring now in Russia. And so you start to see suicide rates among men skyrocketing. The life expectancy of men fell to 58. Between 91 and 91, Russia's population overall decreased by 8 million. One of the first calculations of a husband and a wife when they're thinking about having kids is, can we afford to have this kid? And when you're in a Great Depression, the answer to that question is no. And you're so worried about, and it's not just the decisions that you make not to have kids. Sometimes because of malnutrition, you can't get pregnant, or even if you do, the kid dies. For a whole host of reasons, a depression will always impact the population rate. And it did in Russia as well. So this is just like what was happening in Germany. We're setting it up, and the dirty little secret people here in America don't like to acknowledge is that we weren't altogether unhappy when Adolf Hitler took power in Germany. We weren't altogether, we didn't look at that like it was a failure on our part. We saw a German strongman arising to become a bulwark against Lenin and communism, and eventually Stalin, the Soviet Union in the East. And if they could be the bulwark in Europe, we wouldn't have to be. And so early on, there were a lot of folks in America high up in the elites that supported Hitler, especially with money, to help him get off the ground, to help his government take over and rearm Germany and fix its economy and become a strong bulwark against Soviet expansion. Now that changed, but initially, you take America out of the equation, I'm not sure Adolf Hitler ever happens. We helped get him, we created the conditions. We helped create the conditions in Germany whereby the German people were destitute for a strongman, and we propped him up, propped his government up, and especially financially. That's another lesson for another day. Well, here we are doing the same thing here in Russia. And so the question is, who is going to come along and be the guy, the puppet, the guy that we support, subsidize, et cetera, to now that we've created this artificial economic crisis in Russia, which feels very real to the Russian people, but it was all created by us. We imposed this upon them. We introduced them to free market capitalism, but not in a responsible way, not in a way that they could handle, that they could absorb coming off the shock, coming off a command economy. I mean, it's apples and oranges. It's as different as night and day. And we're asking, and of course they're not experienced in it. They don't understand it. None of them have grown up in that system. They haven't been educated in that way. So who comes in to help them? It's us. It's our advisors. It's our governments, our economic advisors we send over. And we intentionally crash their economy so that we could, in keeping with that goal, crush Russia, dismember the country, and turn them against each other and create a weakling in the place of what used to be a very strong competitor. It's all going to plan, is my point. Everything is going to plan, our plan, not their plan, our plan. So they kept looking at us for answers, and we kept giving them bad advice. They said, well, it's because you're not doing enough. So you need to do more. You're not fully committed. You're half in, half out. And so our advisors kept telling the Russians during this period to do more. And of course, that meant less government spending, more layoffs, higher taxes, all these things that we knew was going to hurt their economy even more. We were trying to crash it. It was working. It was almost it almost happened, but they kept turning to us for advice, for counsel. And all of our advice and counsel was not in their best interest. It was in our best interest. Anyway, by 1998, Russia had defaulted on its debt to the IMF, and Western financiers now, and of course, you know what happens, that the debtor is servant to the debt, or how's that go? The borrower is servant to the lender. So now they can't pay back their debt to the International Monetary Fund, to the Western big shots that have been investing in their country. So of course this debt was all bogus. The amount owed was about $40 billion, and Russia has, because of its vast territory, access to trillions of dollars worth of natural resources. So they could have paid that debt with no problem at all. But what we were demanding was cash. And it's kind of like you see what Trump is negotiating right now with Ukraine. We've given them close to $300 billion worth of aid. And, as far as we knew, we were never going to get paid back. Trump comes into power and says, no, we're going to get paid back. Ukraine says, we don't have any money. Trump says, well, you got a lot of resources. You got a lot of mineral deposits. You have a lot of things there that you could pay, or you could give us in lieu of cash money, and we'll call it even. And that's what we could have done in this case. But again, we're not trying to help the Russians. We're trying to crash their economy. So the interest rates hit about 120%. Their stock market collapsed. And so the Western financiers who owned all this debt that the Russians owed to them, these Wall Street moguls, forced Russia to sell off all its foreign exchange and gold reserves to pay off that debt, right? So you pay off your gold and your foreign exchange. So now, you are truly penniless. Again, we could have negotiated something. If we were trying to help them, we would have negotiated to pay that debt by substituting some of their natural resources. But we didn't. We weren't trying to help them. So now the reserves are gone. The ruble falls another 80% in value, and we have successfully crashed their economy. That was, if you remember back, that was goal number one, to crash we've systematically destroyed their economy. It was already teetering on the brink, which is why they broke up under Mikhail Gorbachev and ended 45 years of Cold War and ended the USSR as we knew it. It was to preserve what they still had. And we came in pretending that we had all the advice and counsel to help transition them to a free market economy, and we intentionally crashed their economy. Now, the second goal was to destroy the military. And if you have no money, a military is only as strong as its ability to pay for all the new weaponry and research and development you need. They have no money. And so a lot of their military hardware, is just sitting around rusting. And over the next decade, what was once one of the biggest, strongest, most modern militaries in the world is now in shambles. And as evidence of that, all of a sudden, the Russians start losing wars that they never used to lose before. They lost to Islamic terrorists in Chechnya and Dagestan. These were the same mujahideen, by the way, that we used to support in Afghanistan. They just moved into different areas, and now we're still supporting them. So by proxy, while we're crashing Russia's economy, we're also destroying their military by supporting their enemies who are fighting against them. In 1999, the West bombed Russian ally Serbia, and normally in a case like that, we would have never done it. We were afraid of a Russian reprisal, but we did it with impunity in 1999. And of course, Russia couldn't do anything about it. And it demonstrated to the entire world how weak Russia was. Also in 99, we gave NATO membership to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. And a couple of those countries are right on Russia's border. So, 97 was the first big expansion. Then 99, we do it again. And we're now right up on their border. We've broken the promises that we made. No NATO expansion. We've sent in our advisors to crash their economy, which has succeeded. And because we've crashed their economy, now their military is just a paper tiger. It's a shell of its former self. So that this three-part plan to destroy Russia is working. Boris Yeltsin was the puppet that was allegiant to Washington, D.C., dependent on Washington, D.C. for everything. It's kind of like a good news, bad news kind of a thing. He's got power, I guess, kind of like Zelensky in Ukraine now. He's got power, but it's only because the United States is propping him up. And as soon as the United States pulls the rug out, he's not going to have power anymore, which is exactly what's going to happen to Zelensky, by the way. It's the same playbook. It's the same play and the same playbook. It gets recycled over and over and over again. He's not allegiant to the Russian people because the Russian people aren't paying the bills. The Americans are paying just enough of the bills to keep Russia solvent, but the whole purpose was to create a very weak Russia and eventually break it apart by its ethnic groups. And that was the plan to come. President Bill Clinton, he was president from 92 to 2000, even bragged to Tony Blair, the British prime minister, that he had complete control over the Russian parliament. In fact, in 96, Yeltsin was on the verge of losing his reelection campaign. And why not? I mean, you don't reelect somebody who's presiding over the destruction of his own country. All of a sudden, at the last minute, Clinton and the State Department arranges for an IMF loan to go straight into Yeltsin's campaign. And he flew in all of his own campaign experts into Russia to interfere in the Russian election by helping getting his buddy, his pal, our puppet, Yeltsin, reelected. And it worked. And it was celebrated here at home. The U.S. media was gloating about how the American election interference was so successful. And so, of course, it was so beneficial to us, and we wanted Yeltsin in charge. And so we had articles titled Yanks to the Rescue and Rescuing Boris. And it was just like a big joke. Everybody understood what happened. The only reason Yeltsin won re-election in 96 is because Clinton bailed him out. Money that came from the IMF, Clinton's campaign advisors. It's so ironic that we get so up in arms and we use as a tactic to smear U.S. politicians that they are in bed with Putin or they are in bed with the Russians, and their campaign is being helped along by Russian election interference. This is what was said about Trump in 2016. It's said again right now. All right, they said it again in 2024 that Trump is Putin's boy. And so, you hear this, counterintelligence investigations by the FBI were launched into the Trump campaign off this notion that he was benefiting from Russian election interference. And here we have in 96 evidence that the United States media was bragging about, Clinton was bragging about, that we interfered in their election. More than interfered, we propped up the guy and helped him win, and he was losing. And if it had just been up to Russian people, he would have lost. So this is why we liked Boris Yeltsin. He allowed the American people, or the American government, to come in, and these neocons who wanted to destroy Russia, Boris Yeltsin said, yes, come on in. Here's a welcome mat. As long as you leave me in power, you can come in and do anything you want. You want to buy up all the oil and gas? Buy it. You want to destroy our military and our economy? Do it. You want to turn us into a wholly owned subsidiary of the United States? So be it. Whatever. Just do your thing. And so, yes, we loved Boris Yeltsin. Yes, we loved Mikhail Gorbachev because he presided over the dismantling of the old Soviet Empire. And so we thought, wow, that set our goal in motion. Once their country broke apart, we won the Cold War. Now we could move on to the next phase, which was U.S. hegemony over the entire world. This unipolar world whereby the old Russia is no longer the new Russia. It's broken up and it's destroyed effectively. So yes, we love Mikhail Gorbachev, and yes, we love Boris Yeltsin because they're playing ball. All right, so something happens literally on New Year's Eve as we prepare to change over into the new millennium. December 31st, 1999, Vladimir Putin is appointed president of the Russian Federation, and everything has changed. Everything has changed. No one was prepared, especially the United States, which is operating with this plan, and everything is going to plan. And the Russian leader the puppet that they put in charge is going along with the plan. So everything is going up to plan. And now all of a sudden, a monkey wrench gets thrown into this plan, and his name is Vladimir Putin, because he's going to come in and take control of his country, which we don't want. He's going to come in and immediately see what the United States is up to and kick out all of these corrupt and U.S. supported oligarchs that got rich because the United States made them rich, that benefited from the destruction of their own country. He's going to kick out the U.S. advisors. He's going to say, we don't need your help no more. We got this. You've destroyed us long enough. And we're going to take over the destiny of our own country. We're gonna be the masters of our own destiny and masters of our own fate, so to speak. So, he said all these things, and maybe we just didn't take him serious. But on December 31st, 1999, he said it in his inaugural speech, and then he started to follow up and do what he said he was going to do. He was going to try to improve Russia in every way. He said, economically, we're going to start becoming producers again. Sound familiar? He's going to talk about manufacturing. Militarily, he says we're going to rebuild the military. We're going to be a strong military power again. Politically, we're going to foster. And this is what really started to drive a wedge between the Americans and the Russians, because he says we're going to try to foster relations with Europeans and with the Chinese. Under Mikhail Gorbachev and under Boris Yeltsin, the relationship that mattered the most to the Russians was America, because we had the money to keep them going. And we were the ones trying to help them transition to a free market economy. Now he is saying, I'm going to look elsewhere for help. And then nationalistically, he said, I'm going to reestablish Russia as a great power, which people in America have misinterpreted that to mean, oh, I'm going to reconstitute the old Soviet Empire. But that's not what he said. He goes, I want to make Russians proud again. I'm going to, the world has changed. We're no longer an empire in charge of all these Baltic states. But as far as Russia is concerned, the old Russia, which existed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years prior to becoming the USSR, we're going to reconstitute Russia as a great power. And of course, Americans have used this, the people in the West have used this as a pretext to say, well, Putin's a bad guy. He wants to invade all of Eastern Europe and reconstitute the old Soviet Empire. He never said that, but he did say he wanted to make Russians proud again. So he began taking matters into his own hands. Instead of taking the advice of the Americans, he started doing things his way. And look what happened. And I'm showing you all this because I want you to see why he all of a sudden became a boogeyman as far as the Americans were concerned, the elites of America, the foreign policy establishment. Under Putin, Russian GDP grew from $200 billion in 1999, which was pretty much nothing, to over 2 trillion by 2013. That's a tenfold increase. And he made Russia the 5th largest economy in the world. 2013, and that's an important year because that is about the time when these neocons, sometimes they're referred to as globalists, orchestrated the coup in Ukraine, 2014, to wage this proxy war against Russia. And we've been involved in this proxy war against Russia ever since. This Ukraine problem started in 14. Actually started before that, but when we really went in and interfered in Ukraine to initiate this war between Russia and Ukraine, and of course, it's a proxy war. We're supporting the Ukrainians. This is our effort to destroy Russia because all of a sudden, our 32-year plan was being foiled by a Russian leader. As long as they had Russian leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev and then especially Yeltsin, we didn't have to create these proxy wars. We were destroying Russia with their permission, with their blessing. We're basically inside their government rat fucking it from within their country. But now we've been kicked out. And so we have to change our plans. And now the plan is, okay, they're becoming too powerful. Putin has rejected our advice, our counsel, and our plan, and he's doing it his way, and his way is working. Our way was working by our standards, but it wasn't working for them. Now he didn't care about our standards. He's working for them, his own people, and look what it's doing. And of course, this is making him popular with his people, and that's a problem. And so about the time they become a $2 trillion GDP economy, the 5th largest in the world, we start messing around in the election campaign in Ukraine in 2014, and we get rid of Yanukovych and we replace him with Poroshenko. And now Poroshenko, who is our puppet, will start making trouble for Russian-speaking people in Donbass and create a war with the Russians that we can bleed the Russians with. This is what proxy wars, that's the whole purpose of a proxy war, to bleed your enemy. And you're not bleeding yourself because you're not fighting. They're fighting, but you're supporting the people that are fighting them. And by extension, you're bleeding your enemy. That was the whole point. So he also, during this period, brought down inflation. Remember inflation, you can see the chart here, what has happened to inflation as time has gone on, as Putin's been president of Russia longer and longer. It was wildly out of control in the 1990s. We talked about it, 2,500%. And then 120% in 1998, and then down to 2.4% in 2019. And you can see there was a blip there in 15 and 16, but it's come back down, and now it's 2.4%. And of course, that was in 2019. This is even after the United States and the European Union slapped economic sanctions in 2022, after the invasion, when Putin invaded Ukraine, everybody in the world slapped Russia with economic sanctions. Russia's economy has continued to grow during this time, and it has surpassed Germany, which is one of these EU countries that has participated in this Ukraine war, supporting the Ukrainians, and it's passed Germany as Europe's largest economy. In other words, the efforts by the West through this proxy war to continue to destroy Russia's economy has not worked, because Putin has brought down inflation. He's increased GDP from 100 billion or 200 billion to 2 trillion. And now Russia's economy, has grown and grown and grown to become the largest economy in Europe. In other words, whatever Putin's doing is working, and it's driving the West crazy because, they were so close. We were so close to the ultimate destruction of Russia. As long as we had our hands over the controls in Russia, which we did throughout the 90s, Clinton bragged about it. He told Tony Blair, He went in and he propped up Boris Yeltsin. As long as Yeltsin was in charge, we had complete. But with the turn of the century or into the new millennium, when Putin took over, everything has changed. All of a sudden, their economy has done a U-turn, and they're manufacturing again, creating a huge increase in GDP. Their inflation has dropped, and this is in spite of sanctions, which is supposedly supposed to harm their economy. And of course, the pretext to that was, well, he invaded. Even though we basically begged him to invade, and we caused all of the conditions by which made it necessary for him to invade, so that we could put in these sanctions, so that we could destroy their economy that way. But it hadn't worked. Now, it's interesting. If you do a comparison during the same period of time, while the U.S. debt to GDP has grown, during the same time period that Putin has been in charge, our debt to GDP grew from 56% to 125% between 1999 and 2023. So a 24-year period, our debt to GDP has grown in the United States from 56% to 125%. It's higher than that now. Putin did the opposite, reducing Russia's debt from 100% to 15% GDP, which means there are now over 160 countries in the world that have higher debt to GDP ratios than Russia. You name the economic data point, and since Putin has taken charge in Russia, it has improved in Russia, simultaneous to the fact that those same data points in the West are getting worse. In other words, he's doing a better job of leading his country than our leaders are doing of leading our countries. And I say countries plural, because when I talk about the West, I'm talking about the NATO countries, primarily the United States, primarily Britain, France, Germany, countries like that, but specifically the United States. During the same period of time, Putin has been a better leader for Russia than any of our leaders have been for the United States. And the numbers prove it. It's not like it's not an anecdotal observation. It's not a subjective observation. It's subjective. That the numbers prove it. When Putin took office, Russia had no foreign exchange reserves and very little gold. Remember, we forced them to sell it to us in exchange for their debt. But since then, he has replenished the coffer, and he's made the Russian economy almost immune to downturns, whether they be economic downturns or Wall Street collapses, whatever. Russia now has the 6th largest foreign exchange reserves in the world, as well as the 6th largest gold reserves in the world. And here you see in this graph, this is in spite of the fact that as a result of this Russia-Ukraine war, the United States and the European Union have confiscated much of Russia's foreign exchange reserves. But according to international law, that money, those reserves will eventually have to be returned with interest. And they still, in spite of that, as we stand today, have the 6th largest foreign exchange reserves, as well as the 6th largest gold reserves in the world. So he has taken a country which he inherited, was in the economic shitter, and he's turned it around. The inflation is down to 2.4%, which is less than ours. The GDP has grown from 200 billion to 2 trillion. He's created this 5th largest economy in the world, the largest economy, strongest economy in Europe. The debt ratio has gone down compared to GDP to the point where he's on the high end of that as far as the world countries are concerned. There's 160 other countries that have a higher debt to GDP ratio than Russia. And now he's got the 6th largest foreign exchange reserve. When he started off with basically nothing, 6th largest gold reserves, you start off with basically nothing. And if you look at that graph right there, he's ahead of us as far as foreign exchange reserves are concerned. So you start to see and get a picture why he's become a problem for us, because he's competent. He knows what he's doing. And the guy they had in charge before, our puppet, didn't. And we knew that. And we liked that. We liked it because it led to a weak Russia. Putin, since he's taken charge in basically 2000, has turned Russia around. And since taking over in 2000, he's managed to outsmart pretty much everybody. All these Western globalists, these neocons who had this idea that Russia, they were going to crash Russia and then pick over its bones like a scavenger. It hasn't happened. We've had all these headlines in the West. I just gave you a bunch of data points which show that Putin's economy is improving under him. But that's not what we're told. From 2014 to 16, all we get, and it continues to this day, are these headlines, which are, for lack of a better word, just straight up propaganda. Like Time Magazine, 2004, Putin watches Russian economy collapse. It's just patently false. It's not true. In 2015, Newsweek said Putin meets economic collapse with purges and broken promises. In 2016, as a Wall Street Journal, for Russia, oil collapse has Soviet echoes. 2016, Foreign Affairs, lights out for the Putin regime. 2016, CNN, Russia is seriously running out of cash. And here you see the word crisis with Putin. Putin's broke. Putin's botched jobs. All these 23% interest. It's all. This is what we've been told in the West, is that Putin, in contrast, in 96, we had to go bail out Boris Yeltsin because the economy was so bad in Russia, the Russian people were going to vote him out of power. He'd only been in power a few short years. And it didn't take him long to figure out this guy didn't know what he's doing. We're going to vote him out. And because of our efforts and our money, he won re-election. We meddled in their election. But the point of that is the Russian people were not going to vote him back into power because he broke the economy, or he was in power when the economy was broken by the United States. How in the world has Putin maintained his power in Russia for 25 years if these headlines are true? If these headlines are true, the Russian people would have voted him out a long time ago, but they haven't. And the reason they haven't is because the truth of the matter is he's done well for the Russian people. He's done well for the Russian economy, and he's done it in spite of and against the efforts of the West, who has tried to harm him at every turn because he's not cooperating with the plan, the U.S. hegemony plan, the unipolar plan, the world domination plan. He didn't cooperate. He went his own way, tried to rebuild Russia and tried to reconstitute Russia's ability to defend itself and handle its own economy, not be at the mercy of the West, et cetera, et cetera. He went his own way. And so he became an enemy. And so what we are told in the West is straight up propaganda, as evidenced by the fact he's still there. If he was so bad, if he's so broke, if he botched the job so bad, if the crisis is such that you got 23% interest rate, if he has run Russia into the ground like the West headlines and the Western media says he has, then the Russian people would have gotten rid of him a long time ago. And we would have gone along. We would not have bailed him out like we did Yeltsin because we don't like him. I tell you, we would have celebrated with, and been like July 4th over here if Putin lost an election. But he has stayed, he must be a political genius, number one, to be able to do what he's done in Russia in spite of the headwinds from the United States and NATO and the European Union, all the economic sanctions and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we are the ones being propagandized to believe that he's a bad leader, that he is incompetent, that he's this, that he's that. We are the ones being sold a bill of goods because the Russian people, who know better than we do because they live there and they know they remember what it was like under Yeltsin, i.e. America. So they keep reelecting this guy. You say, well, the elections are rigged, and this and that. Trust me, you cannot stay in power that long in a country the size of Russia with all the enemies that Putin has if things are truly as bad as we have led Americans and the Western people to believe that they are. He would not have hung on to power that long. It's just not possible. So the propaganda is on our side. And so the propaganda continues, because once the invasion happened, once the war started in Ukraine, the media predicted all these bad things would happen to Putin, all these bad things would happen to Russia, and none of it's come true. You see how Biden said in 22, he said the ruble will turn into a rubble. And this is basically his desire, and all of these neocons' desire to use the Ukraine war as a proxy to destroy whatever progress Putin has made. That we were accomplishing our goals at a rapid rate until Putin stepped in. And so then we had to reevaluate. And at that point, we had to meddle in the Ukraine elections to create a pretext for a Ukraine-Russia war, whereby we could support Ukraine and all of Europe could support Ukraine. And this would be a way for us to accomplish our goal. This is kind of a revised plan to the original plan. If we have to use a proxy war, so be it. And all of the predictions said that Russia would lose because the whole world is allied. You see that world rallies against Putin. There's no way Putin can win. The whole world is against him. Biden makes it personal. He says, I don't think much about Vladimir Putin. This is a United States president saying this. This is one of the things world leaders, if you're smart and you understand diplomacy, you don't make things personal because it makes it tough to see from their perspective why they're doing what they're doing. And if it becomes personal, then you're always going to be on the opposite side and you're never going to find any common ground on anything. It's one of the things these neocons hate about Trump. He says, well, why not talk to Vladimir Putin? Why not have a dialogue with him? It's better not having a dialogue. For 4 years, when Biden was president, we had no dialogue with Putin at all. There was no communication at all. And now Trump's come in and he's picked up the phone, called him, and reestablished some measure of communication. And the neocons hate that because it's in their interests to create a boogeyman. The boogeyman is Putin. And you can't have any communication with that boogeyman because he might actually make some sense. He might actually say something or propose something or agree to something that will force you into a corner where you have to agree with them or you have to, maybe back down off the ledge that you've been pushing your country onto for all these years, trying to leverage us into a war, which is the point. So here we are in this proxy war. We're still getting this bad information. I still see things in the news to this day. It says that the Ukrainians are winning. And they're not even close to winning. The average age of the Ukrainian soldier now is 30 years old because they've run out of young men. They're going and recruiting guys forcibly, just throwing guys that are walking their dog on the side of the road. They force them into a van and throw them out in the front lines to fight the Russians. The average age is 30. Right? They're running out of troops. And if it hadn't been for our money and our weapons, they wouldn't have anything left. They're losing. Russians have gained territory, which is why Putin can stall and play slow play in peace talks because he has all the leverage. And to get a sweeter deal, he can just let the war go on a little bit longer. That's going to be the tricky part for Trump, trying to negotiate with somebody who's winning. How are you going to get him to willingly stop when he's winning? And Putin's no idiot, as we've learned. He has outsmarted the West at every turn. For the last 25 years, he's been in control of a country that he inherited was on the brink of disaster. And against the advice and counsel of everybody in the West, he did the exact opposite, and he brought his country back from the brink. The economy is back. The military is back. The Russian pride is back. They love their leader. They keep reelecting him. And in spite of sanctions, in spite of a war, his debt to GDP ratio is higher than ours. His economy, his inflation is lower than ours. I could just go on and on and on. In other words, he is succeeding and we are failing. And we don't like him for that. We resent him. There are some other indicators. Again, this is not subjective observations. This is objective data. This is hard data. Under Putin, oil production in Russia has doubled from 99 to 2015. That's kind of an old graph there, but it's doubled. It's continued to rise. It's also set records in grain production. It is the world's #1 exporter of wheat. And he has done something that not even the United States has done. He's made Russia the premier exporter of natural and organic food. He rejected all GMO foods and food products. And so he glommed onto something that has become really important. We've realized in the last, I think it's probably the best manifestation of the Americans' realization that GMO is bad is the fact that Trump won the last election, knowing that he was going to put in charge of the DHS or HHS, Robert Kennedy. And he talked about making America healthy again. And we became a lot more aware during this last campaign of just how unhealthy our food is and how unhealthy our population has become because of its diet. And the chronic disease rate in America, you look at the chronic disease rate in Russia and compare it to the chronic disease rate in America, there's no comparison. And we supposedly have the best healthcare in the world, but we eat crap. And one of the decisions Putin made was we're not going to eat that same crap. We're going to have a strong and healthy population. And if the Americans want to eat the GMOs, they'll be unhealthy. And that's exactly what's happened. So some of this doesn't even have anything to do with the economic welfare of the country necessarily or the military. It has to do with just daily living and the health of the citizens. And again, Putin's doing a better job watching out for his citizens than the American leaders are doing watching out for their citizens. They have a healthier population than we do. And in the same time period that he's been in charge, and we've had these 5 or 6 presidents, he's done a better job with food, with public health, with the economy, with the military, with handling debt and handling inflation, handling all these different issues. He's done a better job. Objectively, he's been a better leader for Russia than our presidents have been, or our Congress have been, or our leaders have been for America. He's been better. And I think that is just objectively true. Remember, we talked about how the military he inherited was in shambles, was losing to terrorists in Chechnya and other places. These terrorists that were supported by the West. Putin, and it was Putin who defeated the CIA armed jihadists in Chechnya, finally. Under Yeltsin, they were losing. And he came in and he won and beat in a proxy war against the Americans, the terrorists that we were supporting. He rebuilt the Russian military. And in fact, the production of world-class weapons, if you compare us to them, he has surpassed the United States in hypersonic missile technology. In other words, they have better missile technology than we do. The new fighter jets, tanks, and missile defense systems are just as good, if not better, in some cases, than their American counterparts. In other words, if you are an old guard Cold Warrior and you were around back when we were in this arms race against the Russians, and they beat us into space, and this and that, they caught up with us when it came to nuclear technology, and there was this race between us and them during the good old days. Well, the good old days are back, because under Putin, he has revitalized the military, whereby during that brief period of time from 90 to 2000, a 10-year span when Yeltsin was in charge, after crashing their economy, their military became so weak they couldn't even beat terrorists who were fighting in Chechnya, backed by us. They could not produce. They weren't producing anything. They didn't have any money. They were broke. And so their military was becoming a shell of its former self. Well, now Putin, in the last 25 years, has rebuilt it. And now all of a sudden we're staring at the abyss, realizing that not only is Putin beating us economically, not only is Putin beating us as far as public health, not only is Putin beating us politically, strategically, tactically in this Ukraine war, he's staring down the world in this Ukraine war and he's winning. Not only is all that happening, he has also rebuilt his military to such a degree that we don't want to mess with them no more. If Putin had not happened, there would have come a point we wouldn't have had to, we could have just walked in and taken over Russia. Their military was so bad. And, but that's not, that day has passed. And it's all because of Putin. Everything changed in 2000 when he took over. That's why I call him the foil. When the US tried to destroy Syria, which is an ally of Russia, Putin intervened and helped destroy NATO-funded terrorist group like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. All right, same thing in Africa. Many countries are currently aligning with Russia and kicking out the American and French militaries because they see, here's what these countries do. These third-party countries, they look at, they put their finger to the wind. They say, who's strong and who's weak? We want to be allied with the strong, not the weak. And what's happening is some of these other countries are doing a cost-benefit analysis. They're looking at the objective data just like we are, and they're saying Russia's strong and the Americans and the French are weak. And so we want to be with Russia. That's the history of these third-party countries. They just swing back and forth to whichever side is strongest, and because they need to be allied with a strong country. And so now they're voting with their allegiances. They're betraying what the world thinks about Putin versus the West. They're saying, we think Putin would win. We think Putin is stronger, and we're going to ally with him. So here again is evidence that he is doing a better job, and folks in the know are noticing. So then we fast forward to Ukraine, the current situation. The Russian military has single-handedly faced the entire might of America. And obviously they're not fighting us and our soldiers, but they're fighting our money. They're fighting our weapons. They're fighting all the NATO countries, which we've seen have gobbled up most of the countries, even up to and including the countries on Russia's border. The weapons, the money, the intelligence, the spies, the mercenaries, all these rent-a-cop soldiers. It's Russia alone standing against the world, just like that headline said, and they're winning. The West is spending 20 times more in Ukraine than Russia is, and the Russians are winning. As it currently stands today, the Russians are winning. Why? Because they have a better leader. They have a leader who understands, how to win. And he long ago chose a path different from what the Americans in the West wanted Russia to go down. And it has been very beneficial to his country. It's been very beneficial to his people. He's rebuilt everything that was destroyed. And now in the confrontation, the proxy war that we thought we would win easily, he's winning. But it doesn't stop there. Culturally, Putin has become sort of the anti-West. Because while the West has gone on this kick, especially here in America, anti-religion, anti-spirituality, anti-traditionalism, Putin is doing the opposite. He has rejected cultural Marxism. He's built over 10,000 churches and monasteries in Russia in the last 10 years. He's also given several speeches about this that Of course, the West poo-poos the speech, and because it's Putin saying it, but he's passed laws protecting children from values that he say in the West are destructive. They don't align with Russia's traditional moral and cultural values. And he points out, for example, one of the values that he says is very important is the value of the family, and how he points out in his speech, they're pretty interesting. You can find them on YouTube, where Putin talks about the West and how it devalues the family. And he says, that's cultural suicide. And it'll eventually destroy your own country from within. The value, the strength of your country is made up in the individual families, in the family units. And so you see pictures of him like you do here, posing with family, to try to send a message to the Russian people about how the leader of their country, how much importance he places on the family unit. And when you get that message from the leader, and pictures and images and speeches and laws passed to protect the family unit, it filters down. And all of a sudden, the Russian country and the culture of Russia has become very family centric, family oriented. Where at the same time, the family is under attack. The family unit is under attack in America and other Western countries. So here again, he's deviating. He's going the opposite direction. He went the opposite direction economically. He went the opposite direction militarily. He went the opposite direction as far as public health. Now he's going the opposite direction as far as culture is concerned, values. This is, when you get into just studying Putin a little bit, you realize the guy is disciplined. Unlike Biden, who we just saw said something about how he never even thinks about Putin. He doesn't want to think about him, and how he's laughing about how the ruble is going to be a pile of rubbles as a result of this war. You never hear Putin say something like that. He never demagogues his opponents. He doesn't sensationalize things for his press or for his constituency. He's very measured in the words that he uses. In the speeches that he gives. He always refers to Americans as, quote, our partners. When's the last time you heard Americans refer to the Russians as our partners? When's the last time you heard an American president say anything even close to conciliatory or even complimentary of Putin? They'd be blasted in the press. They'd be called a Putin lover. Trump has said some things about Putin, and he gets blasted for it, but he's almost inoculated against it now, because everyone just assumes, everybody knows this about Trump, that he respects Putin. He thinks he's called him a genius. He's very smart politically. In other words, what Trump has noticed about Putin is all the things that we just noticed as we went through this PowerPoint, all these different data points. He's just called it out and said what it is. But every other leader we've had has never missed an opportunity to call Putin Hitler. I guess that's probably why Trump respects Putin, because he's been called Hitler as many times as Putin. So, they have that in common. Anybody who doesn't go along with the 32-year plan of world hegemony by the United States, this unipolar world, this world domination, anybody doesn't go along with that, NATO expansion, constant wars, must be a Putin lover, must be a Hitler, because the two leaders that have stood up to that mindset and to that plan, one is the American president, Trump, the other is the Russian president, Putin, and they're the ones getting compared to Hitler. Everybody else is okay. Isn't that interesting? The overheated rhetoric on our side directed at Putin is not responded to in kind by Putin when he's talking about us. In other words, he's more disciplined than we are. He's a gifted politician. Go listen to his interview he did with Tucker Carlson for about 2 hours. About an hour of that is a history lesson, just off the top of his head, about the history of the world. And he's just talking to Tucker, telling, I've heard him in other interviews, and he is just, he doesn't need a teleprompter. He can do long interviews and press conferences without any notes. He just sits there and banters. And the knowledge base, I can appreciate this because I've taught history. And so I sort of, I appreciate people that understand backstories, understand all of the different nuances that go into things, world events, and can draw from all these different experiences and all these different events and put that into some sort of semblance of a dialogue that makes sense that relates to the current situation. You can really appreciate that kind of thinking. And rather than being these prisoners of the moment, these recency bias thing where you just, oh, Putin bad because he invaded Ukraine. Really? Is there more to the story? And so he's very gifted. In 2001, he gave a speech in front of Germany's parliament, and he talked in German, fluent German. He chastised someone the other day. It was I saw it on YouTube. Somebody asked him a question and asked it in English, and he chastised. And this guy was not English, but he assumed that Putin would want to answer the question in English, and so he asked him in English. And Putin chastised him and says, "Why do you speak to me in English?" And I don't remember if the guy was German or what. Let's just say he was. He says, "Why not speak to me in German? Use your language. Be proud of your language. I've got an interpreter if I need, but I can understand German too. Use your language. Don't borrow the West. Don't borrow America's language. Use your language. Speak to me in your language and leave it up to me to interpret what you're saying. But don't borrow somebody else's." He was chastising this reporter for asking a question in English. And this was Putin's way of saying, listen, I can communicate in your language. You don't have to find a common language for me. I can understand the guy's brilliant. He knows, it's just unbelievable when you listen to him. And of course, I know what I'm saying is going to be controversial, and some people are going to accuse me of being the same thing they've accused Trump of being. Anybody who tries to find common ground with Putin, if you say anything good about Putin, you must be a traitor, right? I'm just calling out the objective data, just looking at what is. And politically, he's very smart. This is something Trump has noticed, and he's called it out. One of the best things he did was hire Sergei Lavrov, to be his foreign minister. This guy is one of the smartest men in the world. Picture top right here. He's the geopolitical mind that he has is advising. This is one of the things you notice about good leaders is they'll put around themselves other good leaders, other good people, and they're not threatened by it. Sergei Lavrov would have never risen to the powerful position of foreign minister under Joseph Stalin. Somewhere along the way, he'd have gotten purged because Stalin would have viewed him as a threat. Putin doesn't view him as a threat. In that sense, he sort of reminds me of Kennedy. Kennedy used to do this. He would surround himself the best and the brightest because he wanted the best advice from the brightest people, right? In 2001, Putin encouraged the Europeans to forget the Cold War and work towards a new security architecture. This is something the Europeans didn't do. They should have listened to him. The Europeans decided to go with America and become basically wholly owned subsidiaries of American foreign policy at that point. And now they're paying the price because when America, under Trump decides, hey, we're not really interested in defending or propping up Ukraine for the foreseeable future. Europe's like, oh, wait a second, that you promised, but and of course, NATO is nothing without America. Europe's commitment to Ukraine is nothing. Ukraine cannot fight the war with just Europe's commitment to help them. They cannot fight the war indefinitely with European money, European weapons. They need U.S. money and U.S. weapons. And if the U.S. is not going to cooperate any longer, the war is not going to go on any longer. And Europe knows that because they, in the early 2000s, made a decision that whatever America wanted, that's what they were going to support. And Putin told them, listen, don't do it. Don't put your security the future of your security in the hands of the Americans because they'll double cross you. And that's exactly what's happening right now. That's exactly what's happening. And he saw that. He foresaw that. In 2007, he's the one that warned at the Munich Security Conference. He warned the West, don't expand NATO. That's a red line. If you go into Ukraine, that is a red line. Everything that happened after 2007, an argument could be made that Putin warned us that this would happen, and we went ahead anyway, which leads you to ask the question, or to surmise or to conclude that that's exactly what we wanted to happen. Because the only other argument you could make is that you didn't believe Putin when he said it was a red line. But he had never given any indication prior to that he would not, that he didn't mean what he said and said what he meant. So when he said it in 2007, we had to conclude he was serious. And so the only other conclusion is that we didn't care. We wanted this war. We wanted this proxy war with Ukraine. And so we continued to saber rattle about NATO expansion and putting missiles on their border, et cetera, et cetera. Politically, he told the United States when they pulled out, George W. Bush pulled out of the ABM treaties, he said that was a mistake. So the things that Putin, you go back a decade, in some cases 2 decades, the things that he was saying back in 2005, 6, 7, 8, whatever, have all come true. Here we are in 2025, and it's all of the things he said were going to be problems 2 decades ago, and the Americans poo-pooed. Nah, they've all become big problems. In other words, he was right again, and we were wrong. Either that, or we knew he was right, we didn't care. One of the things that he did also, which indicate his political chops, he developed relationships with numerous European leaders. This is why Merkel and Sarkozy knew that when George W. Bush came out and said, we're going to expand NATO into Ukraine and Georgia, this is how those European leaders knew to say, no, we shouldn't do that. That's going to be a problem. Putin's going to take that as an act of war, because they knew him. Instead of hanging up the phone and not communicating with Putin, which was what the American leaders have done since, Biden wouldn't communicate with him. Obama wouldn't communicate with him. After the little reset with Hillary and it fell through, our leaders have taken the approach, we're not going to communicate. We're going to stonewall the Russians. We're not going to talk to them. So we are not in a position to know what Putin's thinking because we don't talk to him. Putin reaches out to these European leaders to talk to them. And that's how they knew to warn us, don't do this. This is going to be a problem. So one just come from Putin, has come from people who knew Putin. Why did they know him? Because Putin made an effort to establish relationships with these European leaders. Schroeder, Merkel, Berlusconi, some of these aren't in power anymore, but even their successors. And biggest thing he did was he worked with Europe to build a vast network of oil and gas pipelines. This top picture on the left, all those red lines represent pipelines. And this is one of the ways in which Putin was able to double the output of oil and gas, natural gas production in his country, to rebuild his economy. And I don't have to go through all those stats again, but you remember all those stats. Everything that they did, or Putin did during this period, economically, was based around their vast natural resources, primarily oil and natural gas. And even with sanctions, and even with the West fighting back against and trying to ruin Russia's economy, because of these relationships that he built with these European leaders in these countries, and the fact that their oil and natural gas is cheaper than American or the West oil and natural gas, he got contracts with these countries. And it was one of the reasons, and he built these big pipelines. And it was one of the reasons why Russia has rebuilt its economy so fast. He found a natural resource that there was a demand for. They had the supply, and there was a demand all over Europe for it, and he provided it. And he went into business. He went into the oil and gas business, which is one of the reasons why we blew up his Nord Stream pipeline. We have, in lieu of his efforts to rebuild the Russian economy, we have been subversively attacking them left and right, left and right. We blocked a lot of their pipelines and coerced some of the European countries to turn down win-win deals, and basically told them, if you want our support, you want our help in case of a war, you want our helps to provide your security, you're going to turn down this pipeline deal, this oil and gas pipeline deal with the Russians, and you're going to buy ours instead. And it was all about hurting Putin and Russia economically. Putin saved the Turk Stream pipelines and avoided the American trap for hostility with Turkey. And then when the U.S. tried to drive a wedge between Russia and Japan, Putin made the effort to meet with the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe 20 different times to try to end any residual conflicts between the two nations. So here the United States tried to drive a wedge between Japan and Russia, and Putin wouldn't let him. He wouldn't let him. So, and same thing in Turkey. I mean, when the U.S. tried to drive a wedge between Russia and Turkey over the Turk Stream pipeline issue, he wouldn't let him. Now, the one caveat, the one area that he did not succeed in was defending the Nord Stream pipeline. You see the map there, there's Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, and we sabotaged both. This was the oil and gas, primarily natural gas, that was supplying most of our NATO allies in Europe, primarily Germany. And it was cheaper than the natural gas they could get from us. And at the outbreak of the Ukraine war, you can see the date there, 2022, we sabotaged those pipelines to right at about the winter time. You can see it's the fall, September 26, 2022, right as we're entering winter, the season when you need natural gas the most to heat your home. We exploded this pipeline to hurt Russia economically, but also to force these NATO allies to buy our natural gas instead of Russians. So to hurt them at the same time they're helping us. And if we could dry up the thinking was if we could dry up their income from these pipelines, then Russia wouldn't have enough money to prosecute the war in Ukraine. That was the whole point of it. And, we'll talk more about that in episode 3. There's a lot of evidence that it was us that blew up that pipeline, but I'll talk about that later. All right. And Putin has also developed a long-term relationship with China. He's met, just like he met with Japan over 20 times, he's met with China, the leader there, Xi Jinping, over 40 times. And then after his inauguration in 2000, he went to China. That's a big step. When a leader goes to another country, that's an indication. It's like Nixon when he went to Russia, and when he went to China first, then he went to Russia. It was Nixon showing the world that even though he was an avowed anti-communist, he was a cold warrior in that sense. He was willing to reach out more than halfway to make the effort to go to their country to find some common ground. And that's what Putin has done. He has solidified. This is the danger. And what America specifically has been engaged in over the last 32 years to destroy Russia has pushed Russia into the arms of the world's largest country when it comes to population. So when you put the world's largest country by geographic region together with the world's largest country by population, and one of the top, and these are 2 of the top 5 economic powers in the world, you put those 2 together, you've just created a juggernaut. We've literally pushed them into the arms of the Chinese. And so while the United States media is busy writing all these articles about China collapsing and about China's economy and et cetera, and it being a vestige of the past, all these different things about how China is a paper tiger, Putin was establishing a long-term customer for Russia's immense energies, thinking if they've got the world's largest population, that world's largest population is going to need oil and natural gas. And that's what we got a lot of. So he's creating customers while the US media and the US government's trying to create enemies. So the next project that Putin has been engaged in here recently is these massive projects, these gas pipelines going to China, which will dwarf the pipeline projects that he's been involved in prior to, trying to provide energy for Europe. China's got way more people. In other words, what Putin is doing is he is securing Russia's future. And he is willing to reach across the aisle. He is willing to make the effort to go to these places. He went to Japan. He went to China, right? And while we're isolating ourselves and calling the Chinese and the Russians the enemies, right? And he's reaching out to them. And it's literally pushing, we are creating the bipolar world that we didn't want. We tried to destroy Russia and create this unipolar world. Instead, Russia has found a leader who has rebuilt it, and he is allying himself with China, which has grown into our bipolar competitor. And now we are on the verge of a tripolar world, maybe even more than that, because India is rising as well. But the point is, two of the three, if you were to put United States, Russia, and China in the same categories, or roughly the same categories, two of those three are allied together against us. And we put them in that category. We did it. We pushed them there. It just makes no sense. That's why I say Putin has done a better job leading his country than our leaders have of leading our country. He's also maintained a very solid relationship with India, which is smart because India is up and coming. It's become a significant buyer. Stop me if you've heard this again before. A buyer of Russian oil over the last 2 years. And what does Russia have a lot of? A lot of oil. He personally turned around the relationship that Russia had with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia during the Cold War was on our side, played a key role in attacking the Soviets by deliberately bringing down the oil price in the 1980s. The oil wars in the 1980s hurt Russia, hurt the Soviet Union. That was the intent. And Saudi Arabia was sort of a proxy doing our bidding in that situation, and it hurt the Soviets. And Putin realized the relationship and how important it would be with Saudi Arabia going forward, especially with respect to oil. Oil politics are so key in a lot of this. And OPEC, Saudi Arabia pretty much controls OPEC. And so he has reached out again. Does that sound familiar? He reached out to Japan. He reached out to Xi in China. And now he's reaching out to the Saudi prince. He went over there, as you can see in this picture, and met with the Saudi prince to turn around what was an adversarial relationship and turn it into a positive one, which, interestingly, the Ukraine negotiations right now, as we speak, are taking place in Saudi Arabia. Russia is meeting with the Russian delegation is meeting with the American delegation. Where? In Saudi Arabia. That would have never happened if Putin hadn't reached out. He would have considered Saudi territory to be adversarial, to be hostile territory, and he'd look for somewhere else. But this is sort of symbolic of the new Russia-Saudi relationship. Why? Because of Putin. He's doing the same thing as we speak with nations in Asia and Africa and Latin America. And so what you see here, hopefully, is what I've tried to paint a picture of why Putin specifically became the enemy in the West, and specifically here in America. It's because he turned around Russia. That 32-year plan to destroy Russia, to create a unipolar world whereby we dominated the world. We were the world's sole superpower. We dismembered Russia from within, manipulating ethnic groups against each other. All that fell apart. It was all working to plan when Yeltsin was in charge. And of course, we were meddling in their elections, for keeping Yeltsin in charge because he was our puppet. But as soon as Putin replaced Yeltsin and realized the enemy was actually us, and kicked out all the advisors, kicked out all the oligarchs that were US puppets, and started rebuilding Russia, rebuilt the economy, rebuilt the military, rebuilt their culture, rebuilt their food supply. As he went his direction and the West continued to go their direction, he became more and more the enemy. And by the time we get to 2014, when they've passed us economically and are looking like they're going to climb even higher, we figure, oh, we got to do something else. So we start meddling in the affairs of Ukraine and their election, and that causes the Donbass war with the Russians. And that proxy war ever since has been our effort to achieve what we couldn't achieve, what we came up short achieving in our first plan. This was the plan B to achieve the destruction of Russia. And of course, because Putin is the one standing in the way, he becomes public enemy number one in the West, specifically here in America. It's interesting. I got some pictures here of people you'll read about. There's no shortage of coverage of these individuals who we accuse Putin of having just killed or poisoned, whichever. You see the guy in the top, he was poisoned. The guy in the bottom, that's a before and after picture, what he looked like after he was poisoned. These are folks that the allegations are that Putin oppressed human rights in his own country to maintain his hold on power by killing off his political rivals or killing off people that might expose him of this or that, whatever. And so while the West is getting this, and I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know. I'm not privy to information that there's never been any evidence conclusively that ties directly back to Putin. But the inference, the allegations from the Western press is that Putin's behind the scenes pulling all these strings on all these people dying, media folks disappearing, et cetera, to maintain his stranglehold on power in Russia. And he's an autocratic dictator, just like Hitler. That's the image. I don't believe anything I hear in US media anymore. So that alone causes me to doubt these allegations. But I put these pictures here just to show you what we've been taught. And yet, in spite of that, for 25 years, the Russian people go back to the polls and reelect him over and over and over again. Now, I'm not sitting here arguing that Putin is a good guy. I'm not even saying he's a bad guy. I'm really kind of neutral on the whole thing. But when it comes to rebuilding his country and being a leader for his country, objectively, if you look at the data points, he's done better for his country than our leaders have done for our country. Objectively, if you look at how the Ukraine war is going and how the whole world was allied, led by the United States against him, Putin is outsmarting the whole world. He's winning, and the rest of us are losing. And so you have to at least acknowledge the fact that he's a worthy adversary, that he is politically smart, borderline genius, and that he is somebody to be reckoned with. And that Russia is somebody to be reckoned with. And you have to ask the question, if you're just a rational human being, has our neocon 32-year plan to destroy Russia gotten us anywhere positive? We're in this Ukraine war. As a result of it, that's killed at least 1 million people, destroyed Ukraine. The objective was to destroy, to regime change, to get Putin out and destroy Russia. It hasn't worked. Putin's come out stronger. He's winning, right? He's got all the cards in the peace negotiations. And instead of creating a unipolar world, which was the objective, we've now given rise to this alliance between the two largest countries in the world, one by geography and the other by population. And Putin, and during that time, has nurtured relationships with another up-and-coming India and Latin America and Asia and Africa and all these different places, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East. And we have literally made him stronger. We have literally forced him, or forced, I don't know how to say this, we have created somebody who is stronger by surviving. It's kind of like Castro in the 60s. He survived all these assassination attempts. He survived all these invasions by the US. And as a result, he got stronger within his own country. He got stronger. His government became more legitimate in the eyes of the world. We legitimized him. We made him the strong leader that he was, just because he survived us. We didn't learn that lesson. And now just like we drove Cuba into the arms of the Soviets, we've now driven Putin and Russia into an alliance with China and other countries around the world. So it's interesting how everything has backfired. And while we are high-minded, we like to chastise Putin for his oppressing human rights and all these different things. We are busy censoring free speech and democratic processes here in the West. We're doing the very things we accuse him of doing. We're doing them here in the West. I showed you all those headlines. They're straight up propaganda. They're straight up propaganda. It's all it is. And that's what serves as news today here in the West. Propaganda, which is what we accuse him of doing in Russia. We're accusing him of going after his political opponents. What just happened in the last election cycle? All of those lawfare attempts to not just get Trump off the ballot, but to put him in jail, to destroy his business, to bankrupt him, to destroy his family. Again, the very thing that we point the finger at him and say he's doing, we're doing here. You say, well, we've never killed anybody. Well, fortunately, but there were two assassination attempts against Trump this last election cycle, 2 times. Now, there's just as much evidence that Biden and his government was connected to the assassination attempt of Trump as there is of Putin being connected to these poisonings of these Russian political figures. But of course, and in fact, there's actually more evidence of Biden's involvement, of his government's involvement in those assassination attempts than there are of Putin. And yet we point the finger at him and we say he's the bad guy, we're the good guy. We're saving the world for democracy against people like him. Oh, really? Oh, really? I wonder how much of that is true and how much of that is straight up propaganda. Because again, he did not go along with the plan, just like Trump did not go along, or has not, or is not going along with the plan. So he is our domestic enemy, and Putin is our foreign enemy. And what binds them together is their resistance for different reasons, but their common resistance to this plan of never-ending wars, NATO expansion, a unipolar world whereby the United States dominates the globe. They both happen. Trump doesn't necessarily oppose the United States dominating the world. He just says, we're not going to fight wars to try to do that. And it's interesting. There's so many commonalities back in 60 with Kennedy. You think about Kennedy being killed in 63. 20 days prior, Ngo Dinh Diem was killed in South Vietnam. And people don't realize, but that was November 2, 1963. That was the same day Kennedy was supposed to be killed in Chicago. On the same day, our deep state was going to try to take out Kennedy and Diem on the same day. They missed. They got Diem, but they got Kennedy 20 days later. And what's the relevance to today? They were both opposed to a Vietnam War, the United States involvement. The Diem brothers had decided the U.S. was causing more problems than it was worth, and that for him to get Vietnamese support to fight the communists or Ho Chi Minh or whatever, for him to get support for his government, he was going to have to turn his back on the U.S. That's the conclusion he had reached by the time we get to November 1963. So we took him out because he was an impediment to U.S. involvement in Vietnam War. Well, what about Kennedy? In October, he had signed National Security Action Memo 263, which said, we're pulling out the first 1,000 troops from Vietnam, and after I win re-election, I'm pulling out the rest. There will be no Vietnam War. In other words, you have 2 leaders, one foreign, one domestic, opposed to the deep state plan of a war in Vietnam, and both were assassinated, taken out. And what was the net result of that? LBJ greenlighted the Vietnam War within days of having taken office. They removed the obstacles to the Vietnam War, to the plan, by assassination, and replaced both with folks that were amenable to the plan, who would go along with the process. Now, fast forward to today. Putin demonstrated clearly since he took power in 2000, he is against the plan. So he has become public enemy number one in America. The Ukraine war, as stated by Biden, and in episode 3, I will show this, is about regime change. It's about taking out Biden or taking out Putin. Why? Because he's against the plan. When Trump ran in 2016, he was against the plan. They tried to smear him with the Russia hoax. They ran a counterintelligence sting against him, tried to impeach him twice. And then when he ran again, they tried to assassinate him twice. It's just been an ongoing. Why? Because he's against the plan. There are ways to get rid of presidents or leaders that don't involve assassinations. Assassination is always part of it. And with Trump, they tried twice. And interestingly, both, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, both those assassination attempts have links, direct links to Ukraine. Direct links. So history repeats. When the leaders, foreign or domestic, don't agree with the U.S. hegemony plan of unipolar domination of the world, we get rid of them. We assassinate them back in the 60s. When it happens in 2025, we start wars to get the one thrown out, to accomplish regime change. We use whatever means necessary against our domestic opponent or obstacle, whether it's impeachment, whether it's never-ending FBI investigations, counterintelligence investigations, media, assassination attempts, whatever, to get rid of him. For the same reason, because neither one of them go, for different reasons, but neither one of them go along with the plan. So we have to get rid of them to find somebody who will go along with the process. Remember, since this plan started back in with the fall of the Soviet Union in 90, and all the promises that we made, when that plan started with Brzezinski, all the presidents subsequent, no matter what they campaigned on, were informed once they took office that you are now part of this process, whether you like it or not. And as long as they went along with it, they got a second term. But if they didn't go along with it, bad things happened to them. Bad things. And in Trump's case, which he's sort of the outlier, he did get a second term. And it's a miracle. And that never did they expect that. After 2020, they thought he was dead and gone. Not literally, but figuratively. And so where we are now is in a place where the neocons are trying to figure out a way to keep the plan going, despite the fact that the new president is a realist and agrees with Putin regarding the big issue of the day, and that's Ukraine. So that was a long one today. Part 3 gets pretty interesting. Just a little teaser. Like I said, those 2 assassination attempts against Trump have direct connections to Ukraine, and I'll show those in part 3. Until then, everybody have a great day, and God bless. Thank you.